The landscape of international trade policy has witnessed a significant shift. For many decades following World War II, a broad consensus favored reducing trade barriers, moving away from the high tariffs seen earlier in American history, such as those associated with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act enacted shortly after the Great Depression began. While figures like President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and President Harry S. Truman used selective tariff reduction strategically, the later establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, pushed towards multilateral liberalization. This trend, amplified by neoliberal ideas from the 1970s onward, saw tariffs increasingly viewed with skepticism. However, dissent grew, particularly concerning the impact of agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and the effects of China's entry into the global trading system. This culminated in a return to tariffs as active policy instruments. The administration of President Donald Trump employed selective tariffs, notably on steel, aluminum, and goods from China, primarily presented as leverage for negotiating trade deals. Subsequently, the administration of President Joseph Biden retained many of these tariffs, but sought to integrate them with domestic industrial policy initiatives, such as the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, framing tariffs as a support mechanism for nascent domestic industries in clean energy and semiconductors. Amidst these developments and contrasting sharply with proposals for very high across-the-board tariffs, a distinct concept has gained attention: progressive tariffs. This approach, championed by critics of earlier free trade policies, envisions tariffs not as blunt instruments or mere negotiating tactics, but as targeted tools. The stated goals are specific: bolstering American industry, improving conditions for workers, and establishing global standards for labor practices and environmental protection. Understanding what this alternative model entails requires examining its proposed mechanisms and differentiating it from both historical protectionism and the tariff strategies recently deployed or suggested. This vision of tariffs diverges significantly from indiscriminate application. Its proponents argue that such measures should be precisely directed towards fundamental economic challenges, particularly those affecting working-class livelihoods and environmental sustainability, rather than applied willy-nilly, as one analyst described it. A key principle distinguishes this approach. Tariffs are seen not as the primary engine of economic change, but as a necessary complement to a broader industrial strategy. The underlying premise is that factories and industrial capacity require more than just altered import prices. They depend on substantial government action, infrastructure development, streamlined permitting processes, subsidies for research and development, and other supportive measures. In this framework, tariffs act as a form of last-mile insurance, safeguarding the significant long-term investments fostered by programs like the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS and Science Act from being immediately undermined by surges in foreign, often state-subsidized, competition. This contrasts sharply with strategies relying solely on tariffs, effectively betting that higher prices alone will spontaneously generate domestic production. A proposition viewed by some analysts as wishful thinking. The specific mechanisms proposed under a progressive tariff model illustrate this targeted philosophy. One example involves charging tariffs based on the embedded emissions of imported goods. The intended effect is twofold. First, to create a clear price signal, incentivizing both foreign and domestic producers to reduce carbon pollution. Second, to confer an advantage on companies already operating with lower emissions profiles. This seeks to align trade policy directly with climate objectives. Another concrete example stems from a novel provision within the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. This allows for the rapid seizure of goods by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, effectively a 100% tariff, following allegations of specific labor rights abuses during production, such as the unjust firing of workers attempting to unionize. A designated investigation process follows, but the mechanism permits swift action, potentially triggered by signals from unions within Mexico. Goods remain held until the violation is demonstrably remedied. The operational consequence is intended to be rapid recourse for workers, a stark contrast to previous trade agreements where labor provisions were often weak, non-existent as in the original NAFTA, or involved legal processes potentially lasting a decade. Furthermore, this USMCA mechanism has the distinct feature of targeting the specific offending company, rather than imposing penalties on all exporters from that country or sector. This allows trade flows to continue largely unimpeded, while addressing specific downward pressures on wages and labor standards caused by noncompliant actors. Evaluating recent applications of tariffs reveals important distinctions. While the Biden administration largely retained the tariffs implemented during the Trump presidency, its stated objective differed significantly in strategic intent. The approach aimed explicitly to marry tariff policy with domestic industrial strategy. Tariffs were expanded on certain goods, particularly those related to clean energy and semiconductors, viewed as essential complements to the substantial investments being made through the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act. The rationale presented was preventative, ensuring that trillions of dollars invested in building domestic capacity in critical sectors like electric vehicles and advanced computing would not be immediately overwhelmed by anticipated export surges, especially from competitors like China possessing significant excess capacity. This represented an effort to use tariffs as a protective backstop for a subsidy-forward industrial policy. Even in areas like steel, where targeted tariffs initiated by the previous administration were continued, the Biden administration attempted to integrate these measures with broader goals, seeking ways to link concerns about excess capacity with a longer-term agenda for decarbonizing the industry. This contrasts with the tariff applications observed during President Trump's first term. Those actions, while involving significant rhetoric and threats, were operationally more limited. Selective tariffs on specific commodities like steel and aluminum, and primarily targeting one country, China. They were generally framed as tools for negotiating better trade deals, although assessments suggest these efforts yielded limited results in fundamentally resetting trade relationships. Furthermore, the implementation often utilized economic sanctions authorities, such as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, bypassing traditional trade statutes and congressional oversight, with policy shifts sometimes announced through unconventional channels. The current proposals attributed to Donald Trump present yet another distinct model. This approach involves not only advocating for very high, across-the-board tariffs, such as a proposed 10% flat tax on all imports, potentially supplemented by others, but also actively seeking to dismantle the very industrial policy supports enacted previously. The proposed gutting of the Inflation Reduction Act grants and the rescinding of the CHIPS and Science Act funding removes the complementary measures seen in the Biden strategy. This leads to a reliance solely on the punitive effect of high import costs, operating under the assumption, critiqued by analysts like Todd Tucker, that such price signals alone will compel the spontaneous appearance of domestic factories. Moreover, the rhetoric surrounding these proposed tariffs, often invoking reciprocity, stands in contrast to the proposed mechanism of a flat tax applied universally, regardless of the tariff rates imposed by trading partners. True reciprocity would imply matching specific tariff rates, a technically complex process not reflected in the blunt, across-the-board proposals. These differing operational frameworks, targeted integration versus broad application divorced from industrial support, carry profoundly different implications for economic outcomes and strategic positioning. The assessment of outcomes from these differing strategies remains complex. Evidence suggests the trade deal pursued during the Trump administration did little to achieve its stated objectives regarding the U.S.-China trade relationship. Conversely, indications emerged by 2024 that the Biden administration's approach, coupling targeted tariffs with significant industrial policy investments, was beginning to yield results. Reports indicated substantial investment flows into U.S. manufacturing, including from major allied economies like Japan, South Korea, and European nations, directed towards sectors prioritized by the IRA and CHIPS Act, even amidst restrictions concerning entanglement with China. This points towards the potential effectiveness of a strategy where tariffs serve a defined, supportive role within a broader framework. However, the efficacy of any industrial strategy, particularly one reliant on attracting multi-year, multi-decade private sector investment, hinges critically on policy predictability and credibility. The prospect of radical shifts, such as the abrupt withdrawal of promised subsidies or the imposition of volatile, high tariffs, fundamentally undermines the confidence required for such long-term commitments. If businesses perceive that policies supporting domestic production could vanish or be counteracted by sudden, disruptive trade measures, perhaps even reversed based on short-term market fluctuations or political whim, they are unlikely to make the necessary large-scale investments. A strategy relying solely on high tariffs to induce industrialization, absent other supports and lacking long-term certainty, would likely require many years, perhaps a decade, for companies to become convinced the restrictions are permanent before adjusting their operations accordingly, creating potentially a less competitive, semi-autarkic economic structure in the process. This leads to the current strategic concerns voiced by analysts like Todd Tucker. The combination of proposed high across-the-board tariffs with the simultaneous dismantling of existing industrial support mechanisms is seen as creating an acute crisis. The risk extends beyond immediate economic disruption. It threatens to polarize sentiment against any use of trade restrictions, potentially discrediting even carefully targeted, problem-solving tariffs like those envisioned in the progressive model. A severe negative reaction could provoke policymakers across the political spectrum to favor complete removal of tariff authority or the imposition of such stringent congressional controls that future strategic use becomes impractical. This potential policy overshoot could significantly set back efforts to develop more nuanced trade tools aligned with industrial, labor, or environmental goals. Potential moderating factors exist, though their influence remains uncertain. Congress could seek to reassert its constitutional authority over trade policy, potentially limiting executive actions taken under statutes like the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Judicial review might also play a role, examining whether the legal justifications for invoking emergency powers have been met. These represent possible off-ramps from escalating tariff conflicts, but they also introduce further layers of uncertainty. Ultimately, the core issue transcends the immediate debate over tariff levels. The perceived unraveling of a coherent, subsidy-forward industrial policy, coupled with unpredictable trade actions, damages the credibility of U.S. commitments. Even if current tariff escalations are eventually walked back, resolving the immediate crisis without restoring faith in the stability and reliability of U.S. economic strategy leaves the nation in a precarious long-term position, potentially hindering its ability to compete effectively in critical global transitions, such as the shift to clean energy. The consequences of this policy instability extend beyond immediate market reactions. Internationally, abrupt shifts in trade strategy and the potential reneging on domestic industrial support commitments can significantly erode the perceived reliability of the United States as an economic partner and strategic ally. Attracting foreign investment, particularly the kind sought for advanced manufacturing and clean energy sectors, relies heavily on confidence in the long-term stability of the policy environment. Furthermore, efforts to build coalitions with allies on issues like technological standards, supply chain security, or coordinated responses to climate change are complicated when U.S. policy appears volatile or internally contradictory. Domestically, the current trajectory carries the potential to reshape the political landscape surrounding economic interventionism. The intense polarization generated by proposals for high across-the-board tariffs, especially when coupled with attacks on established bipartisan initiatives like the CHIPS Act, could foster a lasting backlash against not just tariffs, but potentially against broader government efforts to shape industrial outcomes. This outcome would represent a significant setback for those who have long argued for a more active government role, including the use of targeted trade tools to address worker displacement and deindustrialization, potentially closing the policy space for nuanced approaches just as they were gaining traction. The long-term structural implications for the U.S. economy are also considerable. A sustained period of high, broad tariffs, particularly if unaccompanied by robust industrial support, risks fostering inefficiency and reducing overall competitiveness, potentially leading towards a less dynamic, more insular economic structure. Conversely, the abandonment of strategic investments in key sectors like semiconductors and clean energy, driven by policy reversals, could leave the nation lagging in critical areas of future global economic growth and technological advancement. Navigating these complex dynamics requires a level of policy coherence and long-term strategic vision. The operational challenge lies not merely in setting tariff rates, but in ensuring that trade policy functions as an integrated component of a credible, stable, and well-defined national economic strategy. Without such coherence, the potential benefits of any specific trade tool, whether targeted or broad, are likely to be undermined by uncertainty and the resulting lack of sustained investment, impacting the nation's capacity to adapt and compete effectively in the evolving global landscape. Therefore, the contemporary debate surrounding tariffs reveals less about the inherent merits or flaws of the tool itself, and more about the fundamental requirements for effective national economic strategy. The divergence between utilizing tariffs as targeted instruments integrated within a broader industrial policy versus deploying them as broad, standalone measures while simultaneously dismantling supportive structures underscores a critical operational reality. Successful strategic use of any economic instrument, particularly one requiring long-term private sector adaptation like tariffs aimed at industrial shifts, demands a predictable and credible policy environment. The current climate, characterized by sharp oscillations in approach and challenges to foundational policy commitments, creates systemic risks that transcend specific tariff rates. It calls into question the very capacity for coherent, sustained strategic action, ultimately conditioning the utility and impact of any trade policy levers employed. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, and be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more geopolitical insights like this. I love hearing your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Share this video with anyone interested in deeper perspectives on current events. Until next time, stay informed and think critically. Thank you.